In a land of many gods, one man heard the voice of the one true God. His name was Abram. He lived in a great city called Ur. The city was busy and full of people. They built tall towers to reach the sky. They worshipped idols made of stone and wood. Abram was a good man living in a world that had forgotten its creator. He looked at the idols and felt an emptiness in his heart. He knew there must be something more, something real, something eternal. He often looked up at the stars at night, wondering who had placed them there with such care and order. One night, everything changed for Abram. It was not a dream, but a voice as clear as the morning sun. It was a voice that spoke with power and love. This was the voice of God. He spoke directly to Abram's heart. God made him a promise. It was a promise so big it would change the world forever. God said, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household." He asked Abram to go to a land that he would show him. This was a strange and frightening request. It meant leaving everything he had ever known behind for a future he could not see. The promise was not just about leaving. It was about receiving. God promised to make Abram into a great nation. He promised to bless him. He would make his name great. Abram was old, and his wife, Sarai, could not have children. How could he become a great nation? The promise seemed impossible. Yet the voice of God filled him with a strange sense of peace. It was a promise that planted a seed of hope in the barren ground of his life. This was the beginning of a special relationship, a promise that would one day become a covenant. God's promise had another part. It was a part that reached far beyond Abram and his own family. God said, "All peoples on earth will be blessed through you." This was the most amazing part of the promise. Abram, a simple man from Ur, would be a source of blessing for the entire world. His life would become a bridge between God and all of humanity. He did not understand how this could be. He only knew that the God who made the stars was speaking to him, and he knew, deep in his soul, that he had to listen and obey. The next morning, the sun rose over the city of Ur. The voice of God still echoed in Abram's mind. He went to his wife, Sarai. He told her everything. He told her about the voice in the night. He told her about the incredible promise. He explained that they had to leave their home, their family, everything they held dear. Sarai looked into her husband's eyes. She saw not madness, but a deep and certain faith. She saw the light of a divine purpose shining there. She trusted Abram. She trusted the God who had called him. She agreed to go with him, wherever the path might lead. Preparing to leave was a monumental task. They had to gather their belongings. They had to say goodbye to friends and family who could not understand their decision. "Where are you going?" they asked. Abram could only answer, "To a land that God will show me." Many thought he was foolish. They could not see the invisible promise that pulled him forward. They only saw what he was leaving behind: comfort, security, familiarity. But Abram's focus was not on what he was losing. It was on the one he was following. Abram also spoke to his nephew, Lot. Lot saw the conviction in his uncle's face. He decided to join them on this great adventure, and so the small group set out. Abram, Sarai, Lot, all their servants, livestock. They left the towering walls of Ur behind them. They stepped out into the vast, open wilderness. The path ahead was unknown. There was no map, no marked road to follow. Their only guide was the promise of God. This was the first step of a long journey, a journey of faith that would test them in ways they could not yet imagine. As they walked, the city grew smaller in the distance until it was just a speck on the horizon. The sun was hot and the land was dry. But Abram did not look back. He kept his eyes fixed on the path ahead. Each step was an act of trust. Each sunrise was a reminder of God's faithfulness. This was the beginning of the promise becoming a reality. A promise made to one man was starting its long journey to becoming a covenant for all people. story of Abraham, the father of faith, had truly begun. The journey began. Abram's caravan moved slowly across the dusty plains of Mesopotamia. The great city of Ur was now just a memory, a story to be told on long nights. The sun beat down on them, relentless and unforgiving. The landscape, brown, gold, stretching out to an endless horizon. For Abram, every step was a deliberate act of obedience. He was leaving behind the world he knew, predictable routines, familiar faces, for a future known only to God. The promise was like an echo in his mind, a constant quiet hum beneath the sounds of the shuffling livestock and the creaking carts. It was his compass in this wild, untamed land. Sarai walked beside him, her face partially covered to shield her from the dust. She had left her home, her friends, the life she had built. Her trust in Abram was a quiet strength, a silent partnership in this leap of faith. Lot, his nephew, was younger and perhaps more restless, his eyes darting around, taking in the new and sometimes dangerous surroundings. He saw the journey as an adventure, a chance to build his own wealth and future, but he also looked to his uncle for guidance, sensing the profound spiritual weight of their exodus. The nights brought a welcome coolness. The caravan would stop, and the servants would quickly set up tents, light fires, and prepare a simple meal. After the day's long march, the quiet of the desert night was profound. It was in these moments that Abram felt closest to God. He would step away from the flickering firelight of the camp and look up. The stars were not just distant lights. They were a nightly reminder of the one who had called him. They seemed brighter here, away from the glow of the city, a brilliant, glittering canopy that spoke of infinite power and a promise as vast as the heavens themselves. Each day presented new challenges, a dried-up well, a dangerous pass, or the simple exhaustion of the journey could have easily sown seeds of despair. There were moments when the promise felt distant, like a dream half remembered. But Abram held fast. He led his people not with a map of the land, but with a map etched on his heart by the finger of God. He learned to listen for God's guidance in the direction of the wind, in the shape of the clouds, and in the quiet stillness of his own soul. This was more than a physical journey. It was an education in trust, a day-by-day lesson in walking by faith and not by sight alone. After many weeks of travel, the caravan finally arrived in the land of Canaan. This was the land God had spoken of, the place he would show Abram. It was a land flowing with milk and honey, a stark contrast to the harsh desert they had just crossed. Rolling hills, dotted with green pastures, ancient olive trees on the slopes. The air was fresh and smelled of earth and life. For the weary travelers, it was a beautiful and welcome sight. Abram felt a deep sense of arrival, a confirmation that he had followed God's direction correctly. This was the place, the beginning of the promise taking root in the soil. Abram chose a spot between Bethel and Ai to make his camp. He pitched his tent there, on a high place with a view of the surrounding hills. This simple act of pitching a tent was deeply significant. It was a declaration of his new identity. He was no longer a citizen of Ur, a dweller in a city of brick and stone. He was now a sojourner, a pilgrim living in a temporary home, his true security found not in walls, but in the faithfulness of God. Sarai began to turn the tent into a home, her presence filling the simple space with warmth and order, creating a sanctuary of peace in the midst of their ongoing journey. Life in Canaan was different. The land was inhabited by other peoples, the Canaanites. They had their own cities, their own kings, and their own gods. Abram and his people were newcomers, strangers in a land that was not yet theirs. They had to be careful, navigating relationships with their neighbors with wisdom and grace. Abram was a man of peace. He did not seek conflict, but instead focused on caring for his family and his flocks. He was a wealthy man, with many servants and large herds of sheep, goats, and cattle. He managed his household with a gentle but firm hand, guided by his reverence for God. In this new land, Abram's relationship with God deepened. The promise was no longer just a memory of a voice in the night. It was a living reality that shaped his every decision. He would often climb the hills near his camp to pray. Alone with the sky above and the promised land stretching before him, he would speak to God as a friend. He would pour out his hopes, his fears, and his gratitude. These moments of quiet communion were his strength. They reminded him that he was not alone on this journey. The God who had called him from Ur was with him still, watching over him in this new and promising land. The initial joy of arriving in Canaan soon faced a harsh test. A famine fell upon the land. The green pastures that had welcomed them turned brown and brittle. The streams began to dry up. The wells began to dry up. The once bountiful land could no longer support Abram's large household. It could not support his vast flocks. The faces of his servants grew thin with worry. The cries of hungry livestock filled the air. This was a severe trial. Had God led them all this way only to let them starve? Whispers of doubt began to creep into the camp like the dry, dusty wind. The promise of blessing felt very far away. Faced with starvation, Abram made a decision. He would take his people down to Egypt. Egypt was known for its great river, the Nile. The Nile kept the land fertile even in drought. It seemed like a logical, practical solution. However, this decision was born of fear, not of faith. Instead of crying out to God and waiting, Abram relied on his own human wisdom. He looked to the power of Egypt for salvation, rather than to the power of the God who had promised to protect him. It was a detour from the path of perfect trust. As they approached Egypt, a new fear gripped Abram's heart. Sarai was a very beautiful woman.
Please say you are my sister, so I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared.
He was willing to compromise the truth and put his wife in a vulnerable position. The man who had bravely left his homeland was now stumbling. Sarai, in submission, agreed. The officials of Pharaoh saw Sarai's beauty and praised her to their king. She was taken into Pharaoh's palace. In exchange, Abram was treated very well. Sheep, cattle, donkeys, camels, servants. He received material wealth, but he had lost his integrity. He had traded his reliance on God for a lie born of fear. The promise seemed to be unraveling, jeopardized not by a famine, but by the failure of the very man to whom the promise was given. His heart was heavy with shame and anxiety. But God did not abandon Abram, even in his failure. The Lord's promise was not dependent on Abram's perfection. While Sarai was in the palace, God intervened directly. He inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife. Pharaoh quickly realized that something was terribly wrong. He understood that he had been deceived and had offended a powerful, unseen God. He summoned Abram before him, his voice filled with anger and fear. "What have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say, 'She is my sister,' so that I took her to be my wife?" Abram stood before the powerful king, humbled and ashamed. He had no excuse. His fear had led him down a path of deceit, and it had taken a divine intervention to rescue him. Pharaoh, wanting nothing more to do with Abram and his powerful God, immediately ordered him to leave Egypt. "Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go." He commanded his men to escort Abram, Sarai, and all their possessions out of the country. They were sent away, not in disgrace, but under the protection of a God who had proven his power even in the court of the mighty Pharaoh. The detour was over. They traveled back to the land of Canaan, returning to the very place where they had first camped, between Bethel and Ai. The famine had passed. The land was healing. Abram returned a wealthier man in possessions, but more importantly, he returned a humbler man in spirit. The experience in Egypt had been a painful but necessary lesson. It taught him that his own schemes and fears were a poor substitute for the protection of God. He learned that God's promise would be fulfilled by God's power, not by Abram's clever plans. He could not protect the promise would protect him. Once again, Abram stood in the high place overlooking the land. He found the altar he had built there before his journey to Egypt. It was a stone monument to his earlier faith. As he stood there, he called on the name of the Lord. It was an act of rededication, a prayer of repentance and renewed trust. He had stumbled badly, but he had not been cast aside. God's grace had covered his failure. He was back on the path, his faith deepened by the trial. The journey continued, not because Abram was flawless, but because God was faithful. The promise remained intact, stronger than ever. As Abram's household and flocks continued to grow, so did the possessions of his nephew, Lot. The land, though recovering from the famine, could no longer support both of their massive herds. The shepherds of Abram and the shepherds of Lot began to quarrel over the best grazing lands and watering holes. The harmony that had marked their journey from Ur was now threatened by the conflict born of their great wealth. This tension was a new kind of test for Abram. He knew he had to act to restore peace. Abram went to Lot with a generous and peaceful proposal. "Let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herders and mine, for we are close relatives." He placed family unity above his own rights and gave Lot first choice of the land. "Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left." This was an act of incredible humility and trust in God's provision. Lot looked up and saw the plain of the Jordan. It was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt he had just left. It was a lush, green, and inviting landscape. He chose this entire plain for himself, pitching his tents near the city of Sodom. From a worldly perspective, Lot had chosen the best land, leaving his uncle with the less desirable, drier hill country. Abram watched him go, not with resentment, but with peace. He trusted that God would provide for him, no matter which part of the land was left. His security was not in the quality of the pasture, but in the promise of God. Years passed in the land of Canaan. Abram was now a very old man. He had great wealth, with many servants and flocks that covered the hills. He was respected by his neighbors as a mighty prince. He had everything a man of his time could want, except for one thing. He had no son. The promise of God, the promise of a great nation coming from him, echoed in his heart. But as he looked at his aging wife, Sarai, and his own wrinkled hands, a deep sadness settled over him. The promise felt more and more like an impossible dream. The passing of each year was a quiet reminder of what he did not have. One night, Abram was sitting in his tent, feeling the weight of his childlessness. The promise that once burned so brightly now seemed like a flickering candle, in danger of being extinguished by time.
In this moment of quiet despair, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. God's voice was not one of judgment, but of comfort. "Do not be afraid, Abram," God said. "I am your shield, your very great reward."
Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir.
"This man will not be your heir," the Lord declared. Then God gave him a command. "Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them."
God led him outside the tent, away from his enclosed space of doubt and into the vast, open expanse of the night. Abram lifted his heavy eyes and looked up into the darkness. The sky above him was a breathtaking spectacle. Away from any city lights, the heavens were ablaze with countless stars. A river of diamonds spilled across a cloth of black velvet. He had never seen them so clearly. They seemed to pulse with a silent, ancient light. He tried to count them, as God had said. He counted 1, then 10, then 100, but he quickly became lost in their infinite number.
They stretched from one horizon to the other, a glorious and overwhelming display of God's creative power. He stood in silent awe. As Abram stared at the magnificent starfield, God's voice came to him again, quiet but powerful. So shall your offspring be.
The words landed in Abram's heart with incredible force. The promise was not just for a son or a family or a tribe. It was for a people as numerous as the stars in the sky. It was a promise of impossible abundance, a future so vast it was beyond human imagination. In that moment, looking at the stars, Abram saw not just celestial bodies, but the faces of his future children, grandchildren, and all the generations that would follow. The vision filled the empty spaces in his heart with a renewed and overwhelming hope. The Bible tells us what happened next in a very simple but profound sentence. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. In that moment, Abram let go of his doubt. He let go of his own plans and his servant Eliezer. He simply chose to trust God. He accepted the promise as impossible as it seemed. This act of faith was what mattered most to God.
Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it?
God did not rebuke Abram for asking for a sign. Instead, he answered by instructing Abram to prepare for a special and solemn ceremony. This would be no ordinary ritual. It was the ancient way to make a binding covenant. God told Abram, "Bring me a heifer, a goat, a ram, along with a dove and a young pigeon." Abram did exactly as God commanded. He cut the heifer in two. He cut the goat in two. He cut the ram in two. He arranged the halves on the ground with a path between them. He placed the birds opposite each other, uncut. It was a powerful, solemn symbol. In a human covenant, both parties would walk the path between the pieces. They would say, "If I break this covenant, may what happened to these animals happen to me." It was the most serious oath, sealed in blood. As the sun went down, a deep, dreadful sleep fell on Abram. A supernatural, thick darkness enveloped him. Between waking and sleeping, God spoke again. He revealed the future. Abram's offspring would be strangers in a foreign land. They would be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. God promised to punish that nation, and afterward, they would come out with great possessions. It was a prophecy of suffering and salvation. Then, as darkness became complete, something amazing happened. A smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared. The firepot and torch passed between the animal pieces. Abram was only a witness. He did not walk the path. God alone passed through the pieces. This was the sign Abram had asked for. God took the oath upon himself, a one-sided, unconditional promise. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, sealing it with fire and blood. More time passed, another 13 years. Abram was now 99 years old. He was long past the age of becoming a father. The promise of a son, confirmed by the stars and sealed by the covenant, still had not come to pass. But God had not forgotten. He appeared to Abram again, this time with an announcement that would mark a new chapter in his life. God began by declaring his own identity. "I am God Almighty. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless." Then God reaffirmed the covenant he had made. "This is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations." To signify this permanent, unchangeable reality, God did something remarkable. He changed Abram's name. "No longer will you be called Abram, for I have made you a father of many nations." Abram's old name meant exalted father, which had become a painful irony since he had no children. God gave him a new name, Abraham. This new name meant father of a multitude. His new identity was not based on his present circumstances, but on God's unbreakable promise. God also gave Sarai a new name. "You are no longer to call her Sarai, her name will be Sarah." Her old name meant my princess, but her new name, Sarah, meant princess, noblewoman. She would be the mother of nations and kings. God was elevating her status to a matriarch for the world. I will bless her and will surely give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her. As a physical sign of this covenant, God commanded circumcision for Abraham and all the males in his household. It was an outward bodily mark to set them apart as God's covenant people. A permanent reminder, passed down generation to generation. Abraham obeyed immediately. On that very day, he took his son Ishmael and all the men in his household, and he circumcised them just as God had told him. It was an act of complete and immediate obedience to this new beginning. Not long after this, as Abraham was sitting at the entrance to his tent during the heat of the day, he looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. He hurried from his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground. He invited them to rest under the shade of a tree while he prepared some food for them. He did not know it at first, but he was entertaining heavenly visitors. One of the men was the Lord himself. Sarah remained inside the tent, listening from behind the flap, curious about her husband's important guests. As they ate the meal Abraham and Sarah had prepared, the Lord asked a pointed question. "Where is your wife Sarah?" Abraham replied, "There in the tent." Then the Lord made a stunning announcement, loud enough for Sarah to hear. "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Inside the tent, Sarah heard this, and she laughed to herself. It was not a laugh of joy, but of cynical disbelief. She was 90 years old. She thought, "After I'm worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure?" The Lord, who knows all hearts, knew Sarah had laughed. He turned to Abraham and asked, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Will I really have a child now that I am old?'" The question hung in the air, exposing the doubt that still lingered. The Lord then made one of the most powerful statements in the entire story, a gentle rebuke and a profound declaration of his power. "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" He repeated the promise one more time, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Frightened that her inner thoughts had been exposed, Sarah panicked and lied. "I did not laugh," she said. But the Lord responded simply and directly, "Yes, you did laugh." There was no condemnation, only a calm statement of fact. Her laughter of doubt would soon be transformed. The promise that had been given so many years ago, the promise of a son, was now on the very brink of fulfillment. The long, weary season of waiting was finally coming to an end. A year later, that same laughter would return, but it would no longer be the sound of disbelief, but the sound of pure, unadulterated joy. Just as the Lord had promised, he was gracious to Sarah. At the exact time he had foretold, the impossible happened. Sarah, at 90 years old, conceived and bore a son to Abraham in his old age. When the baby was born, the camp was filled with a new sound. It was the sound of laughter, but this time it was not the hidden, cynical laughter of doubt. It was the open, joyful, and astonished laughter of a promise fulfilled. Sarah held her son, and she laughed with pure delight. "God has brought me laughter," she declared, "and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." The long, barren winter of her life had finally given way to a glorious spring. Abraham was 100 years old when his son was born. He held the tiny infant in his arms, his heart overflowing with a gratitude so deep it was beyond words. This was the son of the promise, the child of his old age, the living proof of God's faithfulness. He named the boy Isaac, which means he laughs. The name itself was a permanent reminder of the joy that had replaced decades of sorrow and waiting. It was a testament to a God who could turn the laughter of disbelief into the laughter of glorious fulfillment. The entire household celebrated, marveling at the miracle that had taken place in their midst. As Isaac grew from an infant into a young boy, he became the center of Abraham and Sarah's world. He was a constant source of joy and happiness. Abraham would watch him play, his heart swelling with fatherly pride and love. This was the child through whom God would build a great nation, a people as numerous as the stars in the sky. Every day with Isaac was a gift, a tangible expression of God's covenant love. The promise was no longer an abstract idea or a future hope. It was a boy with a cheerful laugh and curious eyes running through the camp under the Canaan sun. This period of peace and happiness was a sweet reward for their long journey of faith. The years of wandering, the famines, the fears, and the long silent decades of waiting all faded into the background. The promise had taken on flesh and blood, but Abraham's faith was about to face its ultimate test, a trial so severe it would demand not just his hope, but his very heart, his future, his beloved son, Isaac. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. The season of joyful laughter came to an abrupt and terrifying halt. The voice of God, which had always brought promises of life and blessing, now came with a command that seemed to shatter everything. "Abraham," God called. And Abraham, ever ready to listen, replied, "Here I am." Then God spoke the most dreadful words Abraham had ever heard. "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." The command was incomprehensible, a direct contradiction of the promise. Abraham's heart must have felt as if it had been pierced by a knife. Isaac, his beloved son, the child of the promise, the one for whom he had waited a lifetime. How could God ask for this? The command made no sense. It seemed cruel and capricious. Every fiber of his being, every fatherly instinct must have screamed in protest. But this time, there was only a terrible silent obedience. The faith that had been forged over decades of walking with God held firm. Early the next morning, while the camp was still asleep and the stars were fading from the sky, Abraham got up. He moved with a heavy, deliberate slowness. He cut the wood for the burnt offering, his hands performing the familiar task. He saddled his donkey. He called 2 of his servants. He called his son, Isaac. He did not wake Sarah. What could he possibly say to her? He simply began the journey, leaving the camp behind, walking toward the mountains of Moriah. The journey would take 3 days. 3 days of walking in silence, with the terrible secret locked in his heart. Isaac, unaware of his father's inner turmoil, walked beside him. He saw the wood, he saw the fire, he saw the knife, but he noticed something was missing. On the 3rd day, as they saw the mountain in the distance, Isaac turned to his father.
"Father?" he asked. "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said. "But where is the lamb for the burnt offering?"
The simple, logical question was almost too much for Abraham to bear. It was the question that had been screaming in his own soul for 3 days. Abraham looked at his son, the boy he loved more than life itself. He saw the trust and innocence in Isaac's eyes. He had to give an answer, but he could not bring himself to speak the horrifying truth. Instead, a profound statement of faith came from his lips.
God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son.
When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham's movements became even more deliberate. He was a man acting in a trance of obedience. He built an altar there. He took the wood he had carried for 3 days and arranged it carefully on the stones. Each stone he placed, each piece of wood he laid, was an act of surrender. He was building the altar for his own son. The task must have felt surreal, a waking nightmare. The 2 servants had been left at the bottom of the mountain. It was just a father and his son, alone with God on the high place. Then came the most terrible moment of all. He turned to Isaac. The Bible does not record the conversation. It does not describe the look on Isaac's face as he finally understood. It only tells us what Abraham did. He bound his son, Isaac. The boy, strong enough to carry the wood up the mountain, did not seem to fight back. He submitted to his father, trusting him even in this terrifying and confusing act. Abraham then lifted his son, his beloved child of the promise, and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. The scene was set. The wood was ready. The sacrifice was bound upon the altar. Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife. This was the final moment, the culmination of his entire life of faith. Every promise, every covenant, every star in the sky had led to this. He was about to extinguish the very light that God had given him. He was choosing to obey God's command even if it meant the death of God's promise. In this moment, Abraham's faith was absolute. He was giving God everything, holding nothing back. He raised the knife to slay his son, his hand steady despite the shattering of his own heart. The blade glinted in the mountain sunlight. Just as Abraham's arm was raised, just as the knife was about to fall, a voice shattered the dreadful silence. It was not the voice of God this time, but the voice of an angel calling from heaven. "Abraham! Abraham!" the angel cried out with urgency. Abraham froze, his hand suspended in midair. "Here I am," he answered, his voice trembling with a mix of shock and relief. The angel's next words were a flood of mercy, washing over his tormented soul. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," the angel commanded. "Do not do anything to him." The test was over. The knife could be lowered. The angel continued, explaining the meaning of this terrible trial. "Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." It was never about the death of Isaac. It was always about the heart of Abraham. God wanted to know if Abraham loved the giver more than the gift. He wanted to see if Abraham's faith was so complete that he would trust God even when his commands seemed to destroy his promises. Abraham had passed the test. He had proven his willingness to surrender everything to God, and in that surrender, he received everything back. Abraham lowered his arm, the knife falling from his grasp. He untied his son, pulling him into an embrace that was full of unspeakable relief and love. At that moment, Abraham looked up and saw something in a thicket nearby. It was a ram, its horns caught in the branches. He realized that his words to Isaac on the way up the mountain had been true. God himself had provided the lamb for the burnt offering. He took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. The smoke from this new sacrifice rose to heaven, not as a smell of death and loss, but as a sweet aroma of faith, obedience, and divine provision. Abraham named that place "The Lord will provide." On the mountain of the Lord, it will be provided. The place of the greatest test became the place of the greatest revelation of God's character. Abraham learned in the most personal and painful way that God is Jehovah Jireh, the Lord who sees and provides. He had walked to the very edge of his faith and found that God was already there, waiting for him with grace and a substitute. The covenant was not broken. It was sealed again, not with the blood of the promised son, but with the blood of a lamb provided by God. With the sacrifice complete and Isaac safe by his side, the angel of the Lord called out to Abraham from heaven a second time. The voice was no longer one of urgent command, but of profound and solemn blessing. The Lord declared, "I swear by myself." This was the most powerful oath possible. God was swearing by his own unchanging character. Because Abraham had obeyed, because he had not withheld his only son, the blessings promised before were now confirmed and expanded. The test had led to the ultimate blessing. The angel then spelled out the magnificent scope of this blessing. "I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies." Then came the culmination. It reached beyond Abraham's family and nation. "And through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me." This was the great purpose behind it all. Abraham's faith was not just for his own benefit. His obedience on Mount Moriah was a pivotal moment in world history. Through his offspring, a singular descendant, a blessing would flow out to every tribe, every tongue, and every nation. The story that began with one man leaving Ur would end with the whole world offered a path to God. Abraham and Isaac walked back down the mountain together. The 3-day journey of dread became a walk of quiet joy and understanding. Abraham now knew God in a way he never had before. He learned God's promises can be trusted even when his ways are mysterious. He saw that God is faithful to provide. The covenant was secure because of his faith in God's grace. The father of faith returned home, his heart filled with the peace of the blessing, a blessing that would echo through eternity. The life of Abraham provides a timeless blueprint for a walk of faith. He is called the father of all who believe because his story shows us the way. He teaches us that faith often begins with leaving our comfort zones, stepping away from the familiar to follow God's call into an unknown future. It requires us to trust in God's promises even when we cannot see the path ahead. Abraham's relationship with God shows us that faith is not about being perfect. He made mistakes. He was gripped by fear. He was plagued by doubt. He tried to fulfill God's promises using his own flawed human logic. Yet God never gave up on him. This is a powerful message of hope. God's grace is bigger than our failures. The core of Abraham's righteousness was not his flawless obedience, but his persistent belief. He kept returning to God, kept trusting in the promise, even after he had stumbled. His life shows that God is looking for a willing heart, not a perfect record. And he is faithful to complete the work he begins in us. The ultimate test on Mount Moriah reveals the deepest truth of Abraham's story. In his willingness to sacrifice his beloved son, Abraham unknowingly acted out a foreshadowing of God's own future act of love. On a nearby hill, many centuries later, God the Father would provide his own son, Jesus, as the ultimate sacrifice for the sins of the world. The ram caught in the thicket was a substitute for Isaac, just as Jesus would become the substitute for all humanity. The blessing promised to all nations through Abraham's offspring finds its ultimate fulfillment in the salvation offered through Jesus Christ. Abraham's story points to the cross. Therefore, the covenant with Abraham is not just an ancient story, it is a living hope. It ends with a vision of blessing for every person on earth. The promise that started with one man and his family expands to include every tribe, every nation, all united under the same sky and invited into the same family of faith. Abraham's legacy is an open invitation to trust in the God who provides, the God who keeps his promises, the God who turns barrenness into abundance, and who turns laughter of doubt into laughter of joy. His journey of faith becomes a pathway for our own, leading us to the heart of a loving and faithful Creator.